Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a major conflict in U.S. history. It did not allow Chinese to enter the country for a long period of time. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into law in 1882, but that is not when different immigration laws were being put into place to stop the Chinese from entering the U.S., and mainly California. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a conflict which sparked change in immigration laws against certain races. Chinese have been immigrating to America since the 1700s, but when gold was found in San Francisco, California in 1848, the Chinese were some of the first people to hear about it. Chinese started coming by the thousands to San Francisco. Most were men looking for money that they could send back to their families in China. Most Chinese were organized into groups of 50 or more to go find gold for different companies. Many white Americans started to get mad at the Chinese because they were taking away all their jobs from them because they would be paid very low wage that the Americans would not take. Many anti-Chinese groups broke out and started riots in the Chinatowns and demanded that something would be done at a national level, and it didn't get passed into law until 1882. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a significant immigration law which discriminated against one race, and this caused immigration to become very strict against certain ethnicities, which still happens today. As more and more Chinese came into the country, they created their own little towns that were called Chinatowns. Chinatowns is where most of the anti-Chinese riots happened. They would come into the Chinatowns and burn down their houses and kill the Chinese who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The anti-Chinese groups did this because they were trying to get the government to create the Chinese Exclusion Act. When the act was finally passed in 1882, the government ran the Chinese out of their houses in the Chinatowns and into the rural countryside. After the act was passed, the Chinese were not allowed to enter the country under any circumstance, and any Chinese still living in the country were pulled out of the gold mines and were only allowed then to own Chinese restaurants or Chinese laundry works. Store owners who had hired Chinese fired them or kept their identity a secret from the public. It got so bad that Chinese were being criticized for the way they carried their laundry down the street, and eventually that way was banned. The act was originally supposed to end in 1902, but the government added on a 10-year extension to the act in the form of the Geary Act in 1892. The Geary Act made it so that all Chinese entering the U.S. had to carry a residence permit. Failure to carry the permit at all times was punishable by deportation or a year of hard labor. This meant that Chinese who were entering the country in search of work could not enter the country, but they did allow merchants, scholars, and students to come, and they could bring one family member. This led way for the Chinese to pose as part of their family. The act was repealed in 1943, mainly because World War II was going on, and the Japanese were creating propaganda about how the U.S. was excluding the Chinese from entering their country when the two countries were allies. This was a conflict in that could have led way to maybe the Chinese would not have been allies with the U.S. if the U.S. kept up with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act was not a full compromise for the Chinese. They could still not enter the U.S. without meeting certain requirements. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a significant immigration law. Before the Chinese Exclusion Act, anyone from anywhere could come to the U.S. with ease. Even after the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943, there were still laws that would not allow the Chinese in, such as the Immigration Act, which did not allow ineligible aliens for U.S. citizenships were not permitted to enter the U.S., and the government set a quota of 105 Chinese into the country per year. Today, President Donald Trump has in place a travel ban, which does not let certain citizens from certain countries fly into the U.S., and does not let Americans fly there themselves. There is also a set of skills that someone has to have if they want to enter the country. They have to be able to provide for the family and have a strong skill set. Before the Chinese Exclusion Act, people coming to live and work in the country could enter without having a very strong skill set. On January 11th, President Donald Trump said this in a meeting he attended.
We can put this up on screen and explain this. I apologize for using this word here, but this is a quote from the president. Why are we having all these people from whole countries come here? Trump said, this is in the Washington Post, according to these people who are in the meeting, referring to African countries and Haiti. He then suggested that the United States go about bringing in people from other countries like Norway, whose prime minister...
This shows that our nation's president wants our country to be filled with more people from countries like Norway, because their people are mainly white. And if you are black, coming from a country that's population is mainly black, or a different race our president does not like, our country might and or will reject you. This is just a way bigger version of the Chinese Exclusion Act, not just discriminating against one race, but many different races at once. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a turning point in the way the government has set the immigration laws, even today. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a huge conflict in our country's history, and there was no well thought out compromise. The only compromises is that the Chinese could now enter the US with little restrictions, but they still had to meet the criteria to enter the United States. In a way, the Chinese Exclusion Act was never repealed, just modified in today's immigration laws. There has really only been 39 years of normal immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act impacted the amount of Chinese that are in the US. To put it into perspective, the Chinese only make up 1.2% of the population. There are more Puerto Ricans living in the US than Chinese. During an interview I conducted with Charlie Chin, a historian at the Chinese Historical Society of America in San Francisco, California, he told me that most of the Chinese that are coming from overseas are going to Canada and not the US. He also said even after the act was repealed, the government still had in place a quota of 105 Chinese to the US, and that did not change until 1968. And the recognition of the PRC by the USA did not happen until 1979. That's only 39 years of normal immigration, and that's not a long time. Considering the Exclusion Act went on for 60 years, that means that the act was in place longer than we've had normal immigration. Hopefully soon, our government will see that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a conflict in history that did not have a true compromise, and will see that it was a major conflict and try to change that it did not have a true compromise. Or they will not see that and will still have similar immigration laws that our great-great-grandparents had to deal with when they were trying to immigrate to the United States. It's 2018, let's try to act like we're from 2018 and not 100 years ago with our immigration laws.